Chapter 13 is Industrial Organizational Psychology, or IO psychology, and these psychologists work in businesses. The industrial psychologists, work primarily in manufacturing centers where you have hourly workers, sometimes working on a factory line, for example. So maybe broadly blue collar laborers, and then organizational psychologists work in the organizational or business setting, um, more of a white collar, cubicled setting where maybe you're doing team building, um, improving employee relations. IO psychologists are working on employee morale, and one of the main goals is to improve efficiency of a business. So whether it's at the level of the production of a product, the manufacturing of a product, or the distribution of that product, the marketing of that product, uh, the um, the sales and customer satisfaction, all of that, the best ways to improve parts of those processes are studied, researched, and explained by IO psychologists. And if you're interested in pursuing psychology for the money, this is going to be where you're going to want to focus because businesses will pay a lot of money to improve the manufacturing productivity or improve employee morale because all of these can be massively influential in growing a company. So if you can improve employee morale like 10%, you're looking at a 10% growth in productivity or possibly more than 10% growth in productivity, and that's going to be of huge value to owners, business owners. So if you can find your way into this field with a master's degree, say, you could be very marketable. So IO psychologists work here in academia, government, consulting firms, and business. So oftentimes you'll see them working in a freelance setting. There aren't a whole lot of IO firms that I'm familiar with because one, like if a company wants to hire an IO psychologist, there may be one person in a state or in a region who is recognized as the IO expert for that business type. So maybe there's a finance organizational psychologist or a manufacturing industrial psychologist. And so you develop your skill set. I also see industrial psychologists work with movement specialists, like on factory lines and other engineers. But you can pretty much work in any area where business is happening, whether it be private or public. So here is the breakdown of those two things. A couple of areas that I forgot to mention in my preliminary introduction. IO psychologists work with the hiring process. So if you've ever taken a course in how to interview or how to be interviewed, that would be something conducted by an IO psychologist. Also, how best to market yourself or brand yourself. These are things that would be studied by organizational psychologists. But also employment or um, employee behavioral issues. So like if you've ever had sexual harassment training or ageism or gender discrimination or racial discrimination training. These are things that are studied and then provided by, in this example, organizational psychologists. I actually have a friend who's an organizational psychologist who works in uh, ergonomics and design. So he actually went to school for engineering and helps along with an organizational psychologist or a team of organizational psychologists at a well-known furniture manufacturer that provides nursing equipment for most of the United States. You actually recognize the name, not from nursing equipment, but that's where he works. They design standing nursing desks, and so you have to study the organizational psychologist studies how the nurses are standing at a station, how sort of mobile it needs to be, how sturdy it needs to be, and you can conduct experiments on all of this. So make sure you have the right materials, the right flexibility of materials, the correct angles, transportability, and so on. If you've ever bought like a new keyboard, and they're less common now, but maybe the little pads that you set right in front of the keyboards, the orientation and ergonomics of a mouse, the height of a chair that you sit in, all of these things, because you spend so many hours maybe at the computer, if you're in a white collar job, especially a computer based job, um, you're going to need to adapt to the seating position, the brightness of the screen. There's so many different factors, and organizational psychologists study that. So this area of IO psychology is called human factors. Now, if we go all the way back to the very beginning of IO psychology, it wasn't called this at the time, but there are a number of studies that were foundational to what would become IO psychology. And those include Cattell, Munsterberg, and Scott. And off the top of my head, I don't know, I'm not familiar with them other than I think Cattell had an intelligence theory, which we looked at. And I don't really, I haven't read Psychology and Industrial Efficiency, but you can imagine industrial efficiency is looking at manufacturing plants, which were relatively young at that point. So the manufacturing line, the idea of producing one part, every person on the manufacturing line does one, it's called the assembly line. Everyone has their one job, and that's like the fastest way, because the fastest way to build products, complex products like cars, everyone has their one job that they get really good at, but they couldn't build the whole car by themselves. They just have their one little job, and so we can look at the efficiency with which to build something, because if it takes 10 people a year to build a car and you can find a way to build 10 cars in the same year with the same number of people, you're going to increase your output by 1,000%, which is really good. Robert Yerkes, or I think it's Yerkes, organized a group that developed methods for screening and selecting enlisted men. This is standard procedure now. If you want to go into the military, there are tests you have to take, physical tests you have to pass, baseline expectations, physical, medical, as well as mental, in order to be fit for duty. And so that whole idea is recognizing there are personality characteristics, there are psychological characteristics, but there's also physiological characteristics that increase the likelihood of success in combat, but also in working as an employee of a company, that can be used to predict who's going to succeed, who's going to fail, what sort of problems they'll run into, and so on. It looks like Scott and Bingham organized a group with a goal to develop selection methods for officers in, I imagine, World War I. Elton Mayo, again, a name that I'm not familiar with off the top of my head. It looks like he conducted studies at Western Electric's Hawthorne work. And these were, it sounds like, some of the very first studies into efficiency in a manufacturing plant. And so earlier it was in the training of military officers and military combatants, and then shifting the focus into government funded, and then shifting the focus into private commerce or private manufacturing. And of course, we know that any manufacturing plant today uses the findings from these studies. Imagine being one of the very first people to look at manipulating variables such as how many hours the workday is. So maybe you're working 40 hours a week, but how do you divide those hours up? Is it 4 10-hour shifts? Is it 8 5-hour shifts and you work 2 of them on one day? Is it 8-hour shifts spread out over 5 days? We can look at it a whole variety of ways. And the way we have it now with the 3-shift system, 8-hour days, seems to be the most efficient, at least for manufacturing. But we see differences in healthcare. So the 12-hour nursing shift, for example. The Hawthorne effect is one of the well-known findings. So this goes back to some of the work that was started by Mayo, it looks like. The Hawthorne effect is recognized in working conditions. If someone is watching you, like a supervisor is watching you, then you are going to improve your performance. If it's building parts, you'll build more of them and you'll do a better job building them if you're being watched and there's like communication. So let's look at some of those factors. Being noticed, watched, and someone pays attention to you. And so now, like, if you've ever worked at a factory, you know that there's always a supervisor for every manufacturing line, and that supervisor is paid more than everyone else, and their job is to simply watch and support the workers doing their job. So it actually pays off to pay someone more money to not be part of the manufacturing line, but to simply watch the other people on the line. So we had 9 people on a manufacturing line. So imagine 9 wages, then you're adding a 10th wage that's more than all the other wages, and they don't actually work on the line. They just supervise. And paying an extra person just to supervise improves productivity. So imagine finding that out. You can be more productive by paying someone to do nothing other than watch. Most supervisors do more than that, though. All right, Kurt Levine researched leadership styles, and if you've ever been in business psychology areas of bookstores, you'll see this is a huge area. So studying leadership styles, structure of work teams, team dynamics, that started in the 1930s, and it's very much alive today. People make a lot of money being experts in that. Frederick Taylor in 1911 strived to engineer, or actually perhaps 1911 was the year they're born. I'm learning. That's what the parenthetical notation means. Strive to engineer workplaces to increase productivity. So you're seeing that a lot. Productivity, manipulating factors to improve productivity. The book Principles of Scientific Management examines management styles, personnel selection, and training. And of course, I mentioned those are all important parts of the organizational psychologist's work. How do you improve productivity from a management perspective? So how do you motivate workers to work harder, better, longer, more efficiently? Notice, so Lillian Gilbreth, this is an important emphasis of the history of women in psychology. So Lillian Gilbreth was one of the first women to become really famous in the history of psychology, and so I always appreciate the inclusion of women in these history books because for a number of years, women weren't even allowed in the American Psychological Association. So that happened in the 1920s, and so to become a notable researcher in psychology as a woman is a tremendous accomplishment during her lifetime. So this is really cool. You may have noticed, you might have a trash can with a little foot-controlled lid. She designed that, as well as the space-saving shelves on a refrigerator door. And so she's credited with a lot of these inventions based on workplace productivity research. Now, I mentioned employee training, employee selection, employee interviewing. All of those things are studied by industrial and organizational psychologists, and you can look at all the different parts that go into it. So again, think if maybe this is something that you see yourself doing in the future, or even how you can benefit from the research that's been done. For example, if you're interviewing for a job and you want to give an excellent interview, look at the research that's been done on how to give a good interview. Oh, here we go. The different types of questions. If you're doing the interviews, and then some of the rules around interviews. So if you don't know what to expect from a job interview, read about the protocols. So a lot of it's pretty standard, no matter what industry you go into. You can probably find examples of questions online as well and how to answer them well. If you've ever started a job and got maybe an 8-hour training session, all of that has been designed around research that's been conducted by IO psychologists, as well as how to help a new employee transition into a new job. Most jobs have annual evaluations. So as a college professor, I have an annual evaluation that I've done every year. I've also been responsible for helping with evaluations for my colleagues and my employees. And so we can recognize that there are a lot of points of feedback that we can get to help contribute to how well we're doing in our job. And one of the things I've learned as a college professor is that doing self-assessments, collecting data on my own, in addition to the data that my university collects for me and that feedback cycle, helps me improve my job and the work that I'm doing. And it also brings me more satisfaction. So I enjoy doing a better job. And there are a lot of points of data collection that I can benefit from. When I first started, I was afraid of any data because I didn't want to hear that I was doing a bad job. But I've become less and less afraid of that as the years have gone by. I realized that it can help me improve. It doesn't need to be a reminder of mistakes that I'm making. If you've ever heard of lawsuits over unlawful hiring processes or firing processes, all of that comes from research that's done in IO psychology, and you can read a little bit about that here. But I'm sure you're familiar with gender discrimination, religious discrimination, age discrimination, and at least in the United States, all of those are protected legally. So you're protected from that discrimination by law as an employee. And so here's the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity written legislation, so you can read about you can actually read, so it says the text from legislation prohibiting employment discrimination. So it's actually written. It's a civil rights bill, Title 8 or Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 1967, and 1990. So here's a summary of the equal employment opportunity protected, demographics. Job satisfaction, of course, like I mentioned earlier, is an important factor in productivity and efficiency. So keeping happy employees means you have to train fewer future employees because you can keep someone a long period of time, and also they'll be better workers and more efficient when they're with you. So here are a bunch of factors that are responsible. This comes from motivation psychology intersecting with organizational psychology. Job satisfaction can be derived from this whole list of factors. If you hate your job, chances are you don't have many of these. So you get poor communication, you're being micromanaged, you have too big of a workload, maybe the feedback you get is inconsistent or unfair, the demands are too high. All you need to do is correct one of them and you'll see immediate improvement in your well-being, and ideally you'll find a job that manages all of these well. And if you do, count yourself lucky because a lot of people hate their jobs. And if you are designing a job, you are a business owner, then this is the list of things that you're going to want to make sure you're supporting in your employees. If you can't support all of them, see that you can support as many as possible. And if you can't support one, find another one and emphasize it, and make sure they know that you're trying to support them. Burnout is a problem in a lot of jobs: teachers, medicine, healthcare, even psychology and psychiatry. So any of these factors can increase the likelihood of burnout in your work. And so take a look at that list. I've seen firsthand the problems that stem from lack of job security, lack of a stepwise progression in a job. So seeing that there's future promotions down the line, as well as like harassment and bullying, discrimination, isolation. Of course, like all of these things are going to make a job less enjoyable, and it'll mean you're looking for something else, or are more likely to burn out. So what can be a threat to job security? So job security means you can keep your job indefinitely, provided you're doing a good job. But even if you do a good job and you have good annual evaluations, it doesn't mean you're guaranteed that the job will be there next year. And so I was working at a university that merged with another university. So it was a college that merged with the university. And a lot of the jobs were redundant. We didn't need 2 presidents. We didn't need 2 provosts or vice presidents of academic affairs, 2 HR people. And then a lot of the professor jobs became redundant. So we, I think, cut about 40 employees, um, but because there was so much uncertainty, a lot of employees left. And the people whose jobs were cut got to keep their jobs, actually, which was pretty surprising, or at least the majority of them, to my knowledge. And so that can happen, and that just means, we don't know what's going to happen. We've had academic programs close, so we weren't taking any more students. And then there's like, well, am I going to have a job in 4 years once our current students leave? But there's a lot of potential threats to your job security, and you're best off finding a job with high job security and then becoming a much relied upon individual at that job, so that you don't have to worry about being replaced. Now, let's say you have a job and you're satisfied with it. It's going to be important for you to find a work family or work life balance. And the idea there is make sure you don't focus all on one to the neglect of the other. Make sure you make space for both of them. So your job can put stress on your home life, and your home life can put stress on your job. And so another thing that organizational and industrial psychologists do is work with employees to develop time-saving strategies, relationship-building strategies, and life organization strategies to make sure that this interaction between work and life, or work and family, doesn't become destructive and can be done as well as possible. Now we have, like, this needs to be updated, but all of the literature and research that's been done on working from home, the benefits and detriments of it. So what does that say about work productivity? And what does it say about the work-life balance? Today we have, I think there might be a slide on it, but since we're connected online and we can answer email, it's like we're working more than 40 hours a week. So you can contact me like over the weekend. My students can. And so sometimes I feel like I'm always on. And so when does work become family time and then family become work? Sometimes those are being blended in an unhealthy way. So there's a lot of research that's being done on how to keep those things separate in a healthy way without negating the benefits of working from home. And then, of course, so here's an interesting finding. Employees' ability to set their own hours, allowing them to work from home different parts of the day, so this is telecommuting, was found to make the work-family conflict worse. So there is some research of the working from home, and I think a lot of that has to do with the boundary set up between work and home. It's like you're never totally working, but you're also never totally home. All right, so this is, if you are a manager, what's the best way to go about your work? So leadership training. So there's two theories. Theory X, the manager assumes workers are inherently lazy and unproductive, or you might think of like a professor thinks that students don't care, they don't try, they're not interested. The theory X, so the goal is I'm going to force them to learn, or as a manager, I'm going to force my employees to work. By threatening them, or by promising them rewards. Then theory Y, so that's extrinsic motivation, theory X. Theory Y manager assumes that people have a desire to do hard work and to be satisfied with their work. So they actually try to cultivate leadership qualities in their employees, let employees be intrinsically motivated. So they they work together with their employees to find creative solutions to problems, and don't feel like they need to micromanage their employees. And I'm sure you've had bosses who've been both, some that have to micromanage you and tell you everything you have to do, and you've got to follow their guidelines to the letter, and then others who invite you to kind of participate in the problem-solving process. So here we have the consequences of those two management styles. In the micromanaging theory X section here, people hate work, they avoid responsibility, they just say, tell me what to do, I'm not going to solve problems on my own, and they're pretty much controlled with like a marionette, like with the strings. Whereas theory Y employees tend to enjoy work more, find it comfortable and natural. They thrive when given responsibility, and they participate in setting their own work goals. So, of course, as a manager, I imagine you'd want the employees in column Y. Therefore, you'd have to approach your management from a theory Y perspective. Here, okay, so there's two main approaches to leadership as identified by Bass, and this is the language that I use when I talk about leadership, so I'm going to focus there. Transactional and then transformational. So I'm sure you know what a transaction is. Like, I give you something, you give me something back. So if you imagine leadership from that perspective, I'm going to promise you payment and job security if you do a certain level of work. And that's as long as both sides are fair and honest and they follow through, it's a predictable management style. But transformational leadership, the goal is to elevate the workers. It's more egalitarian. So the employer is on more equal footing with the employee, and the idea is to transform the workplace so that employees can take ownership of the work that's being done. They're not just doing what they're told for a fee, because once the fee is no longer satisfying, then the employee buy-in just disappears. So they'll go find work somewhere else that will pay them more. But if you are a transformational leader, then chances are you'll have employees that buy into the whole process, that want to participate in it and get satisfaction from it. So we can see some of the key characteristics there. A lot of work today, especially in organizational settings, is team work. And if you've ever done a team project in college, chances are you've seen the benefits and the detriments. So having a co-worker, a co-student who isn't doing as much work as everyone else, or maybe you feel like you're the one stuck doing all of the work. If you're listening to this lecture, then chances are you're the student who does more work than everybody else. And so there's a skill to facilitating teamwork, and it goes back to those leadership skills. So if you find yourself in the position where you're the one doing all the work in a group, think about being the leader of that group and promoting some of these skills. Like, actually, and that'll be great leadership training for you that you can benefit from later on down the road when you find yourself with a full-time job and maybe looking to get into a leadership position. So those group activities can be excellent practice to learn some of those skills. So what are some of the teams, goals, teamwork, and work teams? There are pros and cons of gender diversity in teams. Different types of teams are problem resolution, creative teams, tactical teams. I've worked on each types of these. So a problem resolution team, I might be on a committee to solve an assessment problem or a learning outcome problem. And so we kind of sit around and think, all right, so here's the problem. We need to come up with a solution for it. And we talk about potential solutions, and then we design implementation strategies, and then set up assessment strategies, and then we actually practice that. We implement our strategy, and then we assess whether or not it was effective, and then write a report, and then maybe we do it again if it was unsuccessful, or make tweaks and changes. Creative teams, we might look to promote something new. Maybe we want to, so one of the problems at my university has been like the community, the way the community views our university, or trying to merge the university with the community a little bit more natural of a way than we already had, so that it feels like a university town. The community is proud of the university is involved. So how can we do that? There are a lot of creative teams working on that problem right now, and just kind of proposing, here's what it might look like, or here's where we're headed in terms of like different generations and what they desire in community and how community has changed. And then finally, tactical teams execute a well-defined plan or objective. So that's a pre-existing usually goal of an organization. So like, let's say you're selling cleaning services, then the goal might be like following through on your mission statement of like maybe having the best customer service. And so the tactical team would be designed to make sure that, okay, we're going to test to make sure we have the best customer service. So they're going to design a way to assess that and implement that. So what about teams that don't actually meet? So examines how groups, so the virtual team research would look at how not being together on a project can still promote group cohesion. Again, this is relatively new digital or internet-based community building and group building. I think there's a lot of research that has yet to be done on that. Every job that you work at has a culture, and so whether it's something that everyone takes very seriously or does not take seriously or thinks it's great or thinks it's horrible, the culture within a business or within a community, organizational community, is really important, and it's difficult to build. And so we can look at how community is layered, how it can be produced. So you can take a look at that. I mentioned already sexual harassment awareness training and some of the problems with that. So that's something that organizational psychologists look at and study, and then in terms of how to mediate when a harassment situation has already occurred and how to keep it from happening again, that's something that's studied by organizational psychologists. Violence in the workplace, yikes, that's something that's terrifying. So what are some of the factors that predispose someone to committing violence in the workplace? So you can read about that as well. Human factors was one of the first things that I mentioned, and I talked about it quite a bit there. So I'll let you look at some of the finer details in this slide. Workplace safety, I didn't even think about that. Of course, I'm sure you've heard of lawsuits that have occurred, like in a manufacturing setting, if someone burns themselves or cuts themselves on one of the robots or manufacturing tools. Every workplace has to be designed in a way that is as safe as possible for the employees, and the employees have to know their risk and consent to it. So one time I was working in a factory, and it was over the summertime, and we had a heat wave. And so based on World Health Organization and employment safety protocols, we had to be given like a 10-minute break every 2 hours because of the heat level, how hot it was in the manufacturing floor. And we all thought it was great. We didn't think anything of it. But later, I realized just how much those days drained me. And so if I hadn't had those breaks with the water that they brought us like popsicles, I may have passed out. And so all of that has been studied. What do employees need in order to be safe? Even if they don't realize it themselves, that's all been studied already. And that is it. So again, I want to reiterate that this is one of the areas of research for psychologists that's always going to grow as long as there are businesses and manufacturing and even public, like military organizations. We need quality researchers who can study all of the changing topics and the changing factors to help increase productivity, well-being of employees and workers, training, and problems that emerge. And there's a lot of money to be made in it.